This is Module 4, Lesson 29, titled Multi-Step Problems, All Operations. The goal of this lesson, I can calculate the solution of multi-step equations. Remember that you guys can pause the video whenever you need to and make sure that you're taking good notes throughout. Now if we go to the example, this is a big example with lots of parts to it. Pause the video and rewatch the parts again if you need to understand and absorb the information that's going on in this example. It says, the school librarian, Mr. Marker, knows the library has 1,400 books, but wants to reorganize how the books are displayed on the shelves. Mr. Marker needs to know how many fiction, nonfiction, and resource books are in the library. He knows that the library has 4 times as many fiction books as resource books and half as many nonfiction books as fiction books. If these are the only types of books in the library, how many of each type of book are in the library? So if we read this story, we can understand that it's just about a librarian and organizing some books. But if we take a further look at the specific information that we're given, we can see that the library has 1,400 books total. He also knows that he has fiction, nonfiction, and resource books are the only types of books that he has. He says that the library has 4 times as many fiction books as resource books and half as many nonfiction as fiction books. And the question that we're answering is how many of each type of book are in the library? So, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to draw a tape diagram to represent the total number of books in the library. Well, the total number of books is 1,400. So we can draw a big tape, and we can either put a bracket on top, or we can simply say that this whole thing is going to equal 1,400. Now we're going to come back to that later when we complete the tape diagram, but we're going to now focus on the other parts of the total. It says draw 2 more tape diagrams, one to represent the number of fiction books in the library, and one to represent the number of resource books in the library. Now, the information that we're given says there's 4 times as many fiction as resource books. So when we draw this tape diagram, we need to draw 1 part for the resource and 4 parts for the fiction books. We have to draw it so that there's 4 times as many fiction books as resource books. It says, what variable should we use throughout the problem? Well, I'm going to look at my tape diagram that I have so far, and I know that there's only one piece right there, and that represents the resource book. So I'm going to let that represent R. So we're going to use R, which represents the number of resource books in the library. Next, it wants us to write the relationship between the resource books and fiction books and do that algebraically. So we could say that R represents the number of resource books, and since the fiction books, there's 4 times as many as the resource, we could say that one is 4R. It's going to represent how many fiction books are in the library. Now we're on to the next page. It says, draw a tape diagram to represent the number of nonfiction books. The information that we're given says there's half as many nonfiction books as fiction books. So if we look back at our tape diagram from fiction, there was 4 parts. Nonfiction are going to have half of those. There's only going to be 2 parts. It says, how did you decide how many sections this tape diagram would have? Well, if fiction has 4 parts, so the nonfiction is half of that. So half of that amount is 2 parts. Now it says represent the number of nonfiction books in the library algebraically. Well, we would say if each of those pieces is an R, we go back to our original tape diagram, if that one is R for resource books, and this is 4R for fiction books, these have to be each R's for nonfiction books. That means we have 2R to represent nonfiction books. Now we're going to use the tape diagram, all the things that we've created so far, to solve the problem. I told you we're going to come back to the total. So here's the total amount of books in the library, 1,400. I'm going to first draw one of those R's that represented the resource books, the amount of resource books in the library. And then we had 4R. That was the number of fiction books. And then we have 2R. Those were the number of nonfiction books. Those are the only three types of books in the library. Those three parts have to add up to the total. We can use that tape diagram to write us an equation. So we can put all the R's together. If they have like terms, we can add them together. So R plus 4R plus 2R is going to equal 7R, and that equals the total number of books in the library, 1,400. We're next going to solve that algebraically to determine the value of R. So I'm going to ask myself, is R by itself? Of course not. There's times 7 with it, so I'm going to do the opposite, which is divide by 7. And that means I have to divide by 7 on the other side, which means R equals 200. So R equals 200. And that tells us there are 200 resource books in the library. Now, we know that R equals 2. We want to know how many fiction books are in the library. We're on the next page, by the way. How many fiction books are in the library? Well, remember, fiction was represented as 4R. And I know that R is 200, so I can substitute the 200 in there and solve, and I should get 800 fiction books in the library. And then nonfiction books, remember nonfiction was 2R. If I know that R equals 200, I substitute 200 in there for R and get 400. That tells me we have 400 nonfiction books in the library. So I'm going to skip this next part. We don't need to set up a table. We just need to answer these final questions. How many fiction books were in the library? That was 800. Nonfiction was 400. And then resource books was 200. Does the library have 4 times as many fiction books as resource books? Let's check. Fiction was 800, and resource was 200. That is true, yes. It does have 4 times many. And does the library have half as many nonfiction books as fiction books? Here's the nonfictions again, 800. Half of that's 400. So that answer would be yes. And does the library have 1,400 books? If we add those together, 800, I'm going to add it to 200, that's 1,000, plus 400 is 1,400. All 3 answers are yes. So we can, from this tape diagram, we created a equation to solve for R, which told us how many resource books were in the library, and then we substituted back into the original expressions that we created to figure out how many fiction and nonfiction books are in the library.